In the spring of 2018, I spent about 4 months backpacking through Southeast Asia by myself. I was 24, I'd saved up for years working a job I hated, and it was the kind of trip you romanticize your whole life. For the most part, it lived up to it. But there's one stretch of that trip in a town in Laos called Vieng that I've never been able to talk about the way I talk about the rest. And it's the reason I tell every solo female traveler I meet to trust the feeling in their gut, no matter how rude it makes them seem. If you've never heard of Vieng, it's a small town in central Laos, about 4 hours north of the capital, Vientiane, set in this absolutely stunning landscape of jagged limestone karst mountains and the Nam Song River. For about a decade, it had a reputation as one of the most notorious party towns on the entire backpacker trail. The main draw was tubing, where they'd drive you a couple of miles upriver and you'd float back down the Nam Song on an inflated inner tube, stopping at these riverside bars that lined the route, drinking buckets of cheap whiskey and Red Bull out of sand pails. By the time I got there, the wildest years were over. The government had cracked down a few years earlier after a lot of young travelers had died on that river, but it was still very much a party town, still full of 20-somethings from all over the world, still a place where everyone was a little reckless and everyone trusted everyone, because that's just how the backpacker scene works. You meet someone at a hostel, you've known them for 2 hours, and suddenly you're best friends spending the whole day together. That culture of instant trust is part of the magic of it. It's also, I learned, exactly what makes it dangerous. I was staying in a basic bamboo bungalow, one of those places that cost about $7 a night, with a fan and a couple of thin mattresses on the floor, and a door so flimsy it barely qualified. The first afternoon I went tubing with a group of people from my hostel, the way everyone does, and it was honestly a blast, floating down that gorgeous river with the karsts towering up green and gray on either side. It was on the river that I met the guy I'll call Adrian. He said he was from somewhere in Europe, and he wasn't a fresh backpacker like the rest of us. He told me he'd been traveling around Southeast Asia for over a year, and he'd been in Vieng for weeks, which is far longer than anyone actually stays. He knew all the bars, all the staff, all the best spots. He was charming and helpful, and a little older than the rest of the crowd, maybe in his mid-30s, and at first that was reassuring. He was the seasoned guy who knew the ropes. He kind of attached himself to our group that first day. And specifically to me. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but looking back, there were small things. He asked a lot of questions about my travel plans, where I was headed next, when I was leaving Vieng, whether I was meeting anyone along the way, whether I was traveling completely on my own. He asked which guest house I was staying at, and when I was vague about it, he seemed to make a point of figuring it out, insisting on walking me most of the way back that first night, even though I told him several times I was fine. He knew the town so well that he always seemed to know where I was. I'd be at a cafe in the morning and he'd just appear and sit down. I'd be walking to dinner and he'd be coming the other way. At first I told myself it was a small town, and that's just how it is. You run into the same people over and over, but it started to feel like more than coincidence. The thing about Vieng and the backpacker trail in general is that the people churn constantly. The friends I'd made tubing that first day, most of them left within a day or two, moving on to the next place, the way everyone does. But Adrian stayed, and as my little group of new friends thinned out, his attention on me got more intense and harder to brush off. He started suggesting we do things just the two of us. He offered to take me to caves and viewpoints that were off the tourist track, places I wouldn't be able to find on my own, places that would be just us, deep in the countryside, away from everyone. Every instinct I had was telling me not to go anywhere isolated with this man, but he was so practiced at making it seem unreasonable to refuse, like I was being paranoid or uptight, like what kind of traveler comes all this way and won't go on an adventure with a local expert. The thing that really turned my stomach happened one evening near the end. I'd casually mentioned to him, days earlier, that I was thinking about taking the bus up to Luang Prabang on a certain day. I'd since decided to leave earlier, and I hadn't told him, hadn't told anyone really. That evening, he found me at a restaurant and asked, in this offhand way, why my bag looked packed when my bus wasn't until Thursday. I had never told him my bag was packed. There was no way he could have known that unless he'd been close enough to my bungalow to see inside it, or had been watching my place while I wasn't there. I felt the blood drain out of my face. I made up some excuse and changed the subject, but in that moment I knew, with total certainty, that this man had been watching me, that he knew my movements, and that all the friendliness had been a performance the entire time. I decided right then that I was going to leave Vieng on the earliest bus I could get the next morning, and that I wasn't going to tell him which one or when. I went back to my bungalow, and I'll admit I was scared in a way I hadn't been the whole trip. I latched that useless little door and sat on the mattress in the dark and tried to figure out how I'd let this happen. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps outside my bungalow on the packed dirt, slow ones walking around it. They stopped right outside my door, and then very softly I heard the door handle being tried, the latch straining, and then a gentle knock and Adrian's voice, low, saying my name and asking if I was awake, saying he just wanted to talk. I didn't make a sound. I sat there with my hand pressed over my own mouth, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it through the thin bamboo wall. He stayed at my door for what felt like forever, knocking softly every little while, saying my name, saying he knew I was in there. It's the kind of thing that, if you described it in plain words, sounds almost gentle. In person, in the dark, alone in a foreign country with a latch between you and a man you now understand has been stalking you. It was the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. Eventually, the footsteps moved away into the night, but I didn't sleep at all. I sat up against the wall with my little pocket knife in my hand until the sky finally started to go gray. The second there was any light, I packed the last of my things, left money for the room on the mattress, and walked fast to the spot where the buses leave from. I got on the first one out of town, which thankfully wasn't even going where I'd planned. It was headed somewhere else entirely, and I didn't care even a little. I just needed to be gone before he woke up and went looking. I remember sitting on that bus as it pulled out of Vang, Vieng, watching those beautiful karst mountains slide past the window, shaking, completely unable to enjoy any of it. I never reported it to anyone in Vang, Vieng. Honestly, it wouldn't have done a thing. The tourist police in that part of the world have a reputation, and I had no real crime to report anyway. Just a man who'd been friendly and then knocked on my door at night. But here's the part that's haunted me ever since. When I got to my next stop and I was telling the story to some other travelers, trying to laugh it off the way you do, one girl went very quiet, and then she told me she'd met a guy fitting that exact description in Vang Vieng a couple months earlier. An older long-term traveler who'd latched onto her and made her so uncomfortable she'd cut her stay short and left too. And then a guy in the group said he'd heard similar things, that there was a man who'd basically lived in Vang Vieng for years who befriended solo female travelers, and that more than one woman had reported feeling stalked. Nobody knew his real name. Nobody had ever done anything about it, because in that scene, people are only in town for a few days and then they're gone, and the next batch of travelers rolls in knowing absolutely nothing. I think about that constantly. I think about how the very thing that makes backpacking so wonderful, that instant openness, that willingness to trust the person you met an hour ago, is the exact thing a predator can hide inside of. He could operate forever, in plain sight, because the whole system is built on strangers trusting strangers and then leaving before they ever compare notes. I still travel, and I still love it, but I learned in Vang Vieng that that's just how the backpacker scene is not a reason to override the feeling in your gut. The friendliest, most helpful person in the room is not automatically safe, and being far from home, in a place where no one knows your name and everyone is a stranger passing through, is exactly when that feeling matters most. I got out of there because some part of me finally stopped worrying about being rude. I don't let myself think too hard about what would have happened if I hadn't. This happened to me in 2019, when I was 28, and traveling through Peru on my own for a few weeks. I'd always wanted to see Machu Picchu and the Andes, and I'd finally made it happen. I'd done a lot of solo travel before, all over the place, and I considered myself savvy and careful, and that confidence is exactly the thing that got me. Because the truth I learned the hard way is that the more experienced you think you are, the easier you are to catch off guard. In Peru, like a lot of South America, long-distance buses are how you get around, and the overnight ones are a normal part of backpacking there. You can save the cost of a night's accommodation by sleeping on the bus, and the distances between places are enormous, with the roads winding up and down through the mountains for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time. There are nicer first-class bus companies, the kind everyone recommends, with assigned numbered seats and attendants and your bags checked into the hold with a claim ticket. And then there are the cheaper, more local companies, which are obviously a worse experience but a fraction of the price. I'd taken several buses already without any issue, and on this particular leg, an overnight haul through the Andes between two cities, I was trying to stretch my budget, so I booked a ticket with one of the cheaper companies. That was my first mistake. It was an older bus, the kind with worn fabric seats and a faint permanent smell of diesel and stale food, and it pulled out of the terminal just as the light was starting to fade. It was mostly full of locals, with just a few other foreigners scattered around, headphones in and hoods up. I had a window seat, and a man, a local guy, probably in his 40s, sat down next to me in the aisle seat. He was extremely friendly right from the start. His English was decent, and he struck up a conversation almost immediately, asking where I was from, where I was going, whether I was traveling alone, the usual things. He was warm and chatty and seemed genuinely interested, telling me about his family back home, asking about mine, recommending things I should see and food I had to try, even warning me about which neighborhoods to avoid in the next city, which felt almost darkly funny in hindsight. After several hours on mostly silent buses where I didn't speak enough Spanish to talk to anyone, it was honestly really nice to have someone to talk to, and I let my guard all the way down. We talked for a long time as the bus wound up into the mountains, the engine groaning on the switchbacks, the towns getting smaller and farther apart and then disappearing altogether until the sun went down behind the peaks and the windows went black and the deep cold of the high Andes started seeping in through the glass. There's a particular coziness to being warm on a bus in the dark while the cold presses against the window, and that feeling of safety was exactly the thing being used against me. At some point, a few hours in, well after dark, he pulled out some snacks and offered to share them with me. He had some kind of local sweets and a drink, and he was very insistent, in that hospitable, almost insulted if you refuse way, that I have some. This is the thing every guidebook and every government travel advisory tells you not to do. Never accept food or drinks from strangers when you travel, and I knew that. I genuinely did. But it felt so rude to refuse this kind, friendly man who'd been talking to me like an old friend for hours, on a freezing bus in the middle of the night, and the part of my brain that should have been screaming at me had been completely disarmed by how normal and pleasant the whole thing had been. So I had some, and that's the last thing I remember with any clarity. What I can tell you about the next several hours is almost nothing, and that's the most disturbing part of this whole thing. I have these fragments, these flashes, but they don't connect to each other. I have a vague memory of feeling extremely heavy and confused, like I was underwater, like my body wasn't really mine and my thoughts were happening very far away. I have a flash of the man's face close to mine, talking to me low and calm, and a feeling of doing what he said without understanding why I was doing it. I have a flash of the bus being stopped somewhere dark, but it's all disconnected, like pieces of a dream you can only half remember. There's a drug that criminals in that part of the world are known to use for exactly this. Something that doesn't just knock you out, but makes you compliant and erases your memory of what happens while you're under it. I'm almost certain that's what was in whatever he gave me. I wasn't asleep. I was somewhere else, awake but not in control of myself, and I have no real memory of any of it. I came back to myself sometime the next morning, slumped against the window, with a pounding headache and a mouth so dry I could barely swallow, and this horrible thick fog over everything. It took me a long time to even understand where I was. The bus was pulling into its destination, and then, slowly, the situation started to come into focus, and my stomach dropped. The man was gone. He'd gotten off at some earlier stop while I was out of it, and so was almost everything I had. My day pack, which I'd kept down at my feet with my passport and my main bank card and my phone in it, was gone. The cash I'd had in my money belt was gone, the belt itself unclipped and pulled off me. He'd even taken my jacket, which I'd had bunched up against the window as a pillow. I'd been sitting there, drugged and compliant, while this man went through everything I owned and robbed me and walked off the bus, and not one other person on that bus had noticed anything wrong, because to all of them, it just looked like a foreigner sleeping off a long night. I cannot describe the specific panic of arriving alone in an unfamiliar city in a foreign country with no money, no phone, no passport, and a head full of fog, not even entirely certain what had been done to me. I managed to ask my way to a police station, where I tried to report it, but it was a nightmare. The language barrier made everything harder, and the officers, while not unkind, made it very clear that there was basically nothing they could do. They took a report, mostly so I'd have a document for my embassy and my travel insurance, but they more or less told me that this kind of thing happens, that drugging and robbery on the cheaper overnight buses is a known problem, and that the chances of catching the man or recovering anything were essentially zero. I learned later that the drug they use leaves almost no trace in your system and clears within a day or two, and that victims almost never make it to a doctor inside the window where it could even be detected, so these crimes are almost never investigated and almost never solved. I was just one more report in a drawer. The next several days were a blur of trying to rebuild my life from the road, getting an emergency passport from my embassy, canceling cards over a borrowed phone, wiring myself money, leaning on the kindness of strangers and a couple of other travelers at a hostel who took pity on me. I was lucky in a lot of ways. I wasn't physically hurt, at least not in any way I could find. I got home eventually and put it behind me as best I could. But the part that has never left me isn't the lost passport, or the drained accounts, or even the helplessness of those days afterward. It's those missing hours. I was awake for them. I was conscious. I did things, said things, was moved around, all under the control of a stranger, and I have no memory of a single second of it. There is a specific kind of horror in knowing that your own mind was simply taken from you for a stretch of time, that there's a gap in your life where you were a puppet someone else was operating, and that you will never, ever know exactly what happened inside it. I still don't accept food or drink from strangers when I travel, obviously, but that's not even the real lesson I took from it. The real lesson is how completely a friendly face can disarm you. That man didn't trick me with some elaborate, clever scheme. He just talked to me kindly for a few hours on a cold bus until the careful, savvy traveler I thought I was simply switched off. And then he offered me a sweet, and I took it because refusing felt impolite. I think about all the warnings I'd read over the years and nodded along to, and quietly felt too smart to ever fall for. And I think about how easy it actually was in the end. If you take one thing from this, let it be that the rule about not accepting things from strangers isn't written for other, more naive people than you. It's written for you on the night you feel completely safe. A few years ago, in early 2017, my boyfriend and I took a trip to Mexico City. We were both in our late 20s, it was our first time in Mexico, and we'd been so excited about it for months. The food, the history, the gorgeous neighborhoods everyone raves about like Roma and Condesa. We'd done our research beforehand. We'd read all the standard safety advice, the kind of stuff every travel site repeats. We genuinely thought we were being careful, responsible travelers. But all of that research went straight out the window in the first hour, when we were exhausted and disoriented and just wanted to get to our hotel, and that 1 hour nearly became the worst night of our lives. We flew into Benito Juarez International Airport, the main airport in Mexico City, in the evening after a long day of connecting flights. If you've read anything at all about traveling there, you know the #1 rule that every single guide and government advisory hammers home, which is to never ever hail a taxi off the street, and at the airport specifically, to only use the official, regulated prepaid taxis that you book from the authorized booths inside the terminal. The reason is a crime called express kidnapping, where you get into what looks like a perfectly normal taxi and it's actually being driven by a criminal who takes you somewhere you very much do not want to go. I knew this rule. I'd read it probably a dozen times in the weeks before the trip. I could have recited it. Here's how we ended up breaking it anyway. Our last flight was delayed, and we landed late, completely wiped out. Inside the terminal, the line for the official taxi booth was long and slow, and we were jet-lagged and impatient and just done, and a man approached us, well-dressed, holding a little laminated card, saying he was a taxi driver and asking in good English if we needed a ride to our hotel. He seemed completely legitimate. He quoted us a price that sounded reasonable, and he led us out of the terminal toward the parking area where he said his car was. The car was a normal-looking sedan, not an official marked taxi, and some small voice in the back of my head noticed that. But he had this confident official manner, and we were so tired, and we just wanted to be at our hotel and lying down, so we got in. That was the single worst decision either of us has ever made in our lives. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. He was chatty, asking where we were from, what we were going to see. But then, a few minutes after we left the airport, instead of merging onto the main road toward the city, he abruptly pulled over on a dark, quiet side street. And before I could even process what was happening, the other doors opened and 2 more men got into the car, fast, one dropping into the front passenger seat and one squeezing into the back next to us, pinning me against my boyfriend. And the one in the back had a knife, which he held low where no one outside the car could see it. I will never forget that moment as long as I live, the feeling of the entire world dropping out from under me. The man with the knife was calm, and somehow that made it so much worse than if he'd been screaming. In a mix of broken English and rapid Spanish, they made it very clear what was happening. They already had our phones and our bags off the seat. They told us to stay quiet and do exactly what they said, and we wouldn't be hurt. And then they started driving us around the city, from ATM to ATM. At each one, they would pull up, and one of them would walk my boyfriend, with the knife, over to the machine, and force him to withdraw the maximum amount it would allow on each of our cards, one card at a time, while the others kept me in the car as leverage. Then they'd drive a few blocks to the next ATM and do it all again, and then the next, working methodically through both of our cards, draining each account right up to its daily limit. They made us tell them our PINs. They went through our phones looking for banking apps. The whole time they were calm and businesslike and almost bored, which told me more than anything that they had done this many, many times before. It was a routine for them. We were just that night's job. The most terrifying part wasn't even the knife or the ATMs. It was not knowing how it would end. We had absolutely no idea whether once they'd squeezed everything they could out of us, they would simply let us go, or whether something far worse was waiting at the end of it. I kept watching the streets slide past the window, this enormous unfamiliar city glowing and indifferent all around us, and thinking that no one in the world knew where we were. Not our families, not our hotel, no one. That we had landed only an hour or two earlier and hadn't even checked in anywhere yet. There were stretches where they drove us out toward darker, emptier areas of the city, away from the lights and the traffic, and the two men in front would talk quietly to each other in Spanish I couldn't follow, and I became certain that this was the part where it stopped being a robbery. I held my boyfriend's hand in the back seat so tightly it hurt, both of us afraid to even look at each other too openly, and I genuinely, completely believed we were going to die in that car, in a city we had been in for less than 2 hours, before we'd seen a single thing we'd come to see. This went on for what I think was about 2 hours, though it stretched out into what felt like an entire lifetime. And then, after they'd maxed out everything they could and stripped us of everything of value, they did what, thank God, these men usually do in these situations. They drove to a quiet, unfamiliar residential street somewhere deep in the city, and they stopped, and they told us to get out and walk and not look back. They actually threw our passports out of the car onto the pavement after us, which I learned later they often do, because foreign passports are more trouble to them than they're worth. And then they drove off into the dark, and we were left standing on a strange street corner in a part of Mexico City we couldn't even begin to identify, with nothing but alive. We were in total shock. We eventually found a small shop that was still open, and a kind woman inside helped us, let us use a phone, and helped us figure out roughly where we were. We managed to get to our hotel, where the staff were wonderful and helped us contact the police and, the next day, our embassy. We filed a report, but the officers, while sympathetic, were honest with us. They told us that express kidnapping is extremely common, that it is almost never solved, and that the men who did this to us would, in all likelihood, never be caught or face any consequences whatsoever. I read afterward that less than 1% of these crimes in Mexico ever result in anyone being brought to justice, which is exactly why they're so common. We spent the next several days canceling cards, fighting with the bank, and trying to recover emotionally, and in the end we cut the trip short and flew home early, unable to enjoy a single thing about a city we had been so desperate to experience. What haunts me about it, even now, all these years later, is how avoidable it was, and how the trap was built precisely around the moment we were most vulnerable. These men weren't waiting around for reckless tourists doing something obviously stupid. They were stationed at the airport, at night, waiting for exhausted travelers who just stepped off a long flight and who, in one tired, impatient moment, would take the easy option a friendly man was offering, instead of waiting in a long line for the official taxi. We knew the rule. We had read it over and over and over, and we broke it anyway, in a single weak moment, because we were tired, and a man with a laminated card seemed nice, and the line was long. That is all it took. I still love traveling, and I don't tell this story to scare anyone away from Mexico City, which millions of people visit completely safely every single year. I tell it because the rules that sound paranoid and overcautious when you're reading them at home from your couch are written almost word for word in the experiences of people who learned them the hard way. When you are tired and disoriented in a strange place, and a friendly stranger is offering you the convenient thing, that is the exact moment those rules exist for. Now, no matter how exhausted I am, no matter how long the official line is, I only ever take the legitimate, regulated transport, and I make my boyfriend do the same. Neither of us has ever again gotten into a car at an airport with a stranger because the line looked too long, and we never will. In the summer of 2016, my best friend and I took a backpacking trip through Eastern Europe. We were both 26, we'd been planning it for over a year, and one of the parts we were most excited about was spending time in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, in the region of Transylvania. It's an absolutely beautiful, genuinely wild part of the world, all dense ancient forest and dramatic mountains and tiny old villages, with brown bears and wolves still living in the woods. We wanted to get off the tourist track and experience the real rural Romania, away away from the day trip crowds at the famous castles. We got far more of that than we ever bargained for. Our plan was to base ourselves for a few nights in a remote mountain village and do some hiking in the surrounding peaks. We found what looked like a perfect place online, a guest house, what the Romanians call a pensiun, in a small village high up in the mountains, far from any of the bigger towns. The photos were lovely, an old traditional wooden house with a steep roof, and the price was very cheap, which to two backpackers on a budget felt like a win rather than a warning. It was run by a man, the owner, who I'll call Mr. Petrescu. We booked it, and just getting there turned out to be an adventure in itself. We took a long train and then a slow rural bus to the nearest town, and then we had to arrange for Mr. Petrescu to come and pick us up, because the village was up a long, winding, half-paved mountain road with no public transport at all, deep in the forest. He met us in the town in an old, rattling car and drove us up into the mountains. The drive was probably 45 minutes, the road getting narrower and rougher the higher we climbed, the forest pressing in closer and getting darker on both sides, until we finally arrived at his house. It was genuinely, completely isolated. The very last house in a tiny scattering of buildings, with the mountains and the black wall of the woods rising up all around it, and no other house within sight. Mr. Petrescu was probably in his 60s, weathered and gruff, and he spoke almost no English, and we spoke no Romanian. So all of our communication was gestures, pointing, and a handful of words. He was friendly enough at first, in his rough way, but there was something about him and about the whole situation that put a hard knot in my stomach almost the moment we stepped out of that car, though I couldn't have told you exactly what it was. The first thing that really unsettled me was the passports. When we arrived, he held out his hand and asked for them. Now, this is actually completely normal in a lot of European countries. Guest houses are required to register their guests, and sometimes they hold your passport briefly to copy the details before handing it back. So, on its own, the request wasn't alarming. But he didn't copy them and return them. He took both of our passports, put them away somewhere inside the house, and when my friend gestured to ask for them back, he just waved his hand dismissively and said something we couldn't understand, and made it very clear we were not getting them back right then. So now we were in an isolated house high in the mountains, in a country where we didn't speak a word of the language, with no transport of our own, and the one man up there with us was holding both of our passports. That was the moment the knot in my stomach turned into real fear. The house itself was old and dim, with low ceilings and heavy dark furniture, and it smelled of wood smoke and damp. Our room had a door that locked from the inside, which was at least something, but the whole place felt wrong, and the longer we were there, the worse it got. There was barely any cell signal up there, just the occasional single bar if you stood in exactly the right corner and held your phone up to the window. As the evening went on, Mr. Petrescu's behavior got stranger and more intense. He kept appearing wherever we were, watching us. He'd stand silently in doorways. At dinner, which he insisted on cooking for us and serving in his dark kitchen, he sat down across from us and watched us eat without eating anything himself, just staring, and kept pushing some kind of strong, clear homemade alcohol on us, refilling glasses we hadn't touched, and he seemed to get genuinely irritated, almost angry when we kept politely declining it. He kept asking us things we couldn't understand, leaning forward, gesturing, repeating himself, and there was an urgency and an intensity to it that frightened us both. We retreated to our room as early as we politely could and locked the door, and we sat on the bed and talked in whispers about how badly creeped out we both were. And we did what people always do, which is try to talk ourselves out of it. We told each other we were being paranoid, that he was probably just a lonely old man who rarely got any company, that the language barrier was making everything seem far more sinister than it actually was, that we were two anxious foreigners reading horror movie meaning into a harmless culture clash. We almost managed to convince ourselves, but then, that night, sometime in the early hours of the morning, we heard him. Footsteps in the hallway outside our room, slow and deliberate, and then the sound of our door handle being tried, turning slowly against the lock, stopping, and turning again. We both froze in the dark. The handle turned a third time, and then we heard him just standing out there on the other side of the door, breathing, saying something quietly in Romanian, the same short phrase, over and over and over. We had no idea what he was saying or what he wanted. It might genuinely have been something completely innocent, but two women alone in an isolated mountain house, in the pitch dark, in a country where they can't communicate, listening to a man they're frightened of stand outside their locked door at 3 in the morning trying the handle, do not have the luxury of assuming the best. We were absolutely terrified. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally moved away down the hall, and lying there in the dark, hearts pounding, we made the decision that the second there was light, We were getting out of that house, no matter what it took, even though we had no transport, even though that man was holding our passports, even though we didn't entirely know where on a map we even were. That turned out to be the hardest part, because leaving meant getting our passports back, which meant directly confronting the very person we were terrified of. As soon as the sun was up over the mountains, we packed everything as quietly as we could, found him, and through gestures and a map on my friend's phone, made it as clear as we could that we had to leave immediately, that there was a family emergency back home. A lie. And that we needed to catch a train that day. He did not want us to leave. He got agitated, shaking his head and gesturing for us to stay. And for a few genuinely horrible minutes, I did not know whether he'd let us go or give our passports back at all. My friend was firm, almost aggressive, repeating over and over that we had to go. And eventually, reluctantly, with a dark, unreadable look on his face, he got our passports and put them in her hand. But he flatly refused to drive us back down the mountain. So we walked. We shouldered our heavy packs and walked down that long, winding mountain, knew there were bears, and where every snapped twig made us both jump. And the whole time rode, out of the village and into the forest, the same road he'd driven us up, with no real idea how far it was to anything, just knowing we had to get distance between ourselves and that house. It was a genuinely frightening walk, miles of it, through deep, silent forest where we were terrified we'd hear his old car coming up the road behind us. After a couple of hours, exhausted and soaked in sweat, we finally reached a slightly larger road, and we managed to flag down a local family who, thank God, understood enough to give us a ride down to the nearest town. We got on the first train out, and we left that part of Romania entirely, and we never reported any of it to anyone, because what would we even have reported? A man who cooked us dinner and offered us his homemade liquor and tried his guest's door handle and didn't want us to leave. We had no crime, just a feeling and a language barrier so total we couldn't even be certain what it was we'd actually experienced. And that, in the end, is the part that has stayed with me all these years. To this day, I genuinely do not know what was going on in that house. Maybe Mr. Petrescu was exactly what we feared, and we narrowly walked away from something terrible. Or maybe he was just a strange, lonely old man who almost never had visitors and couldn't understand why two frightened foreigners fled his home in the night, and we badly hurt a harmless person's feelings out of fear and a failure to communicate. I genuinely don't know, and I never will. What I do know is that the listing for that guest house was gone the next time I went looking for it, which could mean anything or nothing. I tried to find the village again on a map once, a year or two later, and couldn't quite place it. The whole thing has taken on an unreal quality in my memory now. Like it almost didn't happen, but I remember the feeling perfectly. That flat animal certainty, lying in the dark listening to that handle turn against the lock, that we were not safe and had to get out. When you're traveling somewhere remote where you don't speak the language and no one knows where you are, that feeling is sometimes the only warning system you have, and it doesn't care whether you can prove anything or whether you're being polite. We listened to hours, and we walked miles through a bear-filled forest rather than spend one more night under that roof, and I have never once regretted it. I would rather have insulted a harmless old man 100 times over than find out, too late, that we'd been right.